Ladies and gentlemen, this is the final match in round one of the International Reparation Debate Competition for 2025. So far, 11 matches have been contested. 11 teams have secured their automatic advancement. 4 teams are awaiting this match to see who will be the 4 wildcards. This match, ladies and gentlemen, will be a hotly contested one. Good afternoon. I am Ravon Thomas Matthews, and I will be a cheer judge for this competition. And I want to welcome you all on this special day. Special not only because we have Club CV Bethel from Bahamas going up against Maggotty High from Jamaica, but special also because today marks the 60th anniversary of the International Convention on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination, the ICERD. This 60th anniversary celebrates a groundbreaking step in the global effort to eradicate racism. Quite serendipitous that the final match of the day and the final series of matches in round one is being held on this their 60th anniversary. Quite an amazing feature. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we would not have been here if not for some very important partners and sponsors. And I'd like to take the opportunity to give them a shout out. We're talking about, of course, the University of the West Indies, CARICOM, the CARICOM Reparations Commission, the Center for Reparations Research, the Jamaican Association for Debating and Empowerment, the P.J. Patterson Institute for Africa Caribbean Public Advocacy, the University of Hull, and the Repair Campaign. We want to thank our partners and sponsors for helping to bring this inaugural competition to life. And what a treat it absolutely has been. Earlier, I told you the 2 teams that would be contesting this match. Let's hear a little bit more from them. We invite the proposition team, Club CV Bethel from the Bahamas, to introduce themselves.
My name is Davon. I'm first speaker. I attend CV Bethel.
My name is Jacqueline Francois. I'm the second speaker, and I attend CV Bethel Senior High School.
My name is Virginia Miller, and I am the third speaker, and I attend CV Bethel Senior High School.
Thank you very much for the proposition team. And at this point in time, we invite the opposition team, Maggotty High School from Jamaica, to introduce themselves.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Zoe Williams, and I attend Maggotty High School.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sean Brown, the second speaker, and I attend Maggotty High School.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brittany Farquharson, and I am the third speaker. Thank you.
And thank you. Joining me on this panel are 2 amazing wing adjudicators who will help me in delivering the decision as to the outcome of this match. We want to hear a little bit from them, starting with Ms. Calicia T. Vassell.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am Calicia T. Vassell. I'll be serving as one of your ring adjudicators for today. I'm looking forward to an exciting match, but I'm sure that both teams will deliver to make it a truly momentous occasion, being the last match in round 1. Thank you and good luck.
Thank you very much, Calicia. And of course, not to be outdone, Mr. Shavar Campbell.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shavar Campbell, and I'll be one of your wing adjudicators for this match. I like the rest of my panel. I'm looking forward to an engaging and exciting match.
As am I, Shavar, as am I. Teams, you've been briefed before on the rules and structure of this competition. But for the benefit of the viewing audience, let's do a quick run through. So this debate will consist of 3 substantive speeches per team. The first speaker will speak for 7 minutes. The second speaker, 6 minutes. And the third speaker, 5 minutes. The first and last minute of each speech is considered protected time in which no points of information will be allowed. Outside of that first and last minute, we not only allow points of information, we absolutely encourage it. And of course, intermingled among those speeches is that exciting period of cross-examination. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the cross-examination period when we arrive at that time. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the motion before us reads, this House believes that Asian indentureship should be separated from the Caribbean reparation movement. Once more, this House believes that Asian indentureship should be separated from the Caribbean reparation movement. With no further delays, we invite the first speaker from Team Club CV Bethel, Devon Miller, to open this debate. The floor is yours, Devon.
Roger, bite into an apple. Crisp, sweet, and familiar. Now, picture peeling an apple, zesty, segmented, and bursting with juice. Both are fruits, yet they are undeniably different. In much the same way, Asian indentureship and Caribbean reparation movement are both rooted in historical injustice, but their nature, struggles, and impacts are distinct. Just as we wouldn't call an apple an orange, we cannot paint these histories with the same brush. Likewise, Asian indentureship and the Caribbean reparation movement stem from historical exploitation, but their experiences, relocation circumstances, and the presence or absence of free will are fundamentally distinct. To group them together overlooks critical distincts. Just as we wouldn't call an apple an orange, we must recognize that these histories demand separate conversations, demand separate conditions, and demand separate paths towards justice. Before we fully devour the motion, let us take a second to dissect important terms. David Northup, author of Indentured Labor in the Age of Imperialism, states that Asian indentureship refers to a system which labor from Asia, particularly India and China, were contracted to work for a set period of time, often under harsh and exploitative conditions, in colonies and plantations around the 19th century and early 20th century. Moreover, Merriam-Webster defines separation as the state of being kept distinct or set apart. In contrast, CARICOMreparation.org noted that the reparation movement has always been consistent in the demands for restitution and the repairing for crimes, chattel slavery in the Western Hemisphere. Therefore, we, the proposition, wholeheartedly agree with the motion. This House believes that the Asian indentureship should be separated from the Caribbean reparation due to the unique differences in relocation experiences and the element of free will. Currently, the Caribbean reparations movement primarily focuses on addressing the historical injustice of native genocide and chattel slavery. However, there is an ongoing debate about whether to include descendants of Asian indentured laborers in this movement. We stand with the advocates for inclusion who argue that despite the contractual nature of indentureship, many laborers face deceptive recruitment practices, harsh working conditions, and systematic discrimination, leading to large socio and economic inequalities. Conversely, some scholars argue that while indentureship was exploited, it differs from chattel slavery and native genocide, which the 2001 UN Durban Declaration and Program Action explicitly recognizes as crimes against humanity, highlighting the legal and historical distinction between the systems. A fundamental distinction between enslaved Africans and Asian indentured laborers lies in their relocation experiences. According to LiverpoolMuseum.org, enslaved Africans endured horrors of the Middle Passage. They were crammed into suffocating, unsanitary spaces with little to no ventilation. Men were shackled together. Women and children were confined separately, and the lack of medical care led to a devastating mortality rate. 1 to 5 did not survive the journey. The trauma of this forced displacement was immediate and profound, as millions were ripped away from their homelands with no hope of return. This was a voyage of brutality.
Point of information.
I decline. This was a voyage of brutality, one that marked the beginning of generations of suffering under a system that viewed them as nothing more than property. In contrast, the research paper, The Voyages of the Clarence, highlights that Asian indentured laborers, while still facing hardship, were provided with designated quarters and basic sanitation methods. They were allotted slightly more space and benefited from the medical interventions and reduced death rates during transit. They endured harsh conditions, but they were not packed into ships like cargoes. They suffered, but they were not legally considered property. While indentured laborers were often deceived into signing an unfair agreement, their journeys included access to fresh air, designated quarters, and rudimentary sanitation. Privileges enslaved Africans were never granted. Adjudicators, I urge you to recognize that you are not dealing with mirrored experiences. We are dealing with two distinct histories, one that erased identity and stripped generations of their autonomy, and another, while exploitative, allowed for eventual freedom. To lump these experiences together under the Caribbean reparation movement is to erase profound systematic dehumanization that defines slavery. We must separate these narratives. We must separate these struggles. We must separate Asian indentureship and the Caribbean reparation movement. The heart of distinction between slavery and indentureship is the element of freedom, a defining factor that underscores why these two systems and their respective calls for justice must remain separate. Enslaved Africans had no agency over their fate. They were forcibly captured, transported in brutal conditions, and sold as property with no legal rights or autonomy. Slavery and remembrance.org. Their entire existence was defined by forced labor with no hope of freedom or choice. In contrast, Asian indentured laborers, while often deceived or coerced, signed contracts that at least outlined the terms of their service and included a clear path to freedom once their contract was completed. Though the terms were often harsh, they were not legally considered property, and they could regain their autonomy after fulfilling their labor obligations. Slavery was an absolute denial of autonomy, whereas indentureship In conclusion, the experiences of Asian indentured laborers and enslaved Africans are distinct and must be separated. In context of reparations, the relocation experiences and total loss of free will in contrast to the Asian indentureship demands distinct approaches. To conflict these two histories would diminish the unique suffering of enslaved Africans. Therefore,
That is time. Thank you very much to the first speaker from Club CV Bethel, Devon Miller. To open the debate for Team Maggotty High School, we invite Sophie Williams.
Judges, Timekeeper, opposing and proposing team, good afternoon. Today, we strongly oppose a motion that this House believe that the Asian indentureship should be separated from the carbon reparation movement. The proposition wants to divide what history has connected. They argue that the Indian indentureship is too different from the African slavery to be included in the movement. However, we challenge this claim and firmly believe that both groups endure systematic colonial exploitation and should stand together in demanding justice. Before I begin, let me rebut a point made by the government. The government said that they had signed a contract, but they were deceived. But they were deceived from the contract because they did not get what they wanted. On to my first substantive. Slavery and indentureship were both systems of forced labor. The African slavery and the Indian indentureship were systems of forced labor created by the Europeans' powers to exploit non-whites. While the slavery and the indentureship had different legal structure, both were designed to control, abuse, and economically disadvantage the Africans and the Indians' laborers. Mr. Speaker, this is why it should not be separated. Ladies and gentlemen, both Africans and Indians were tricked and forced into labor. The enslaved Africans were kidnapped from the West Africa, packed into the ship under horrific condition. Horrific condition, ladies and gentlemen. They had no right, no freedom, and were forced to work for life without pay. Yes, they signed a contract for a better life, but imagine being treated and working without a penny. Imagine separated from your families 5-6 years, and the slave owners use extreme violence and torture toward them. This is exactly what happened to the Asian. They were recruited Indians under false promises of good wages, land, and a better life in Caribbean, signing a contract that they could not read or could not understand. According to the University Press, 2023, by the British recruiters led to the Indians, telling them that they were being taken to a land of wealth and opportunity, only for them to find themselves in a near slavery condition. In Trinidad and Guyana, many indentured workers never received the land or wages they were promised and remained trapped in poverty. So why should the Indian indentureship from the Reparation movement, when both Indians and Africans endured the same exploitation under the same rule? Both groups suffered forced labor, inhuman condition, and long-term effect. By separating them, are we not hindering the fight of justice instead of strengthening it? Dividing the movements weaken both claims and only benefit the former colonizers, allowing them to avoid their responsibility. Think again, my opponents. On to my second substantive. Separating the reparation movement weaken both claims. One of the biggest threats of removing the Indian indentureship from the Caribbean Reparation movement is that it weakened both the Africans and the Indian claim from justice. A divided movement is an easier movement to ignore the history that has shown that the powers use division as a strategy to delay and deny compensation. When oppressors group fight separately, it becomes easier for the government to discuss their demands. They can say that they need more time to access each case separately, causing a delay in reparation. If one group is compensated, they can reject the other group claims by saying it does not meet the criteria or it does not meet the standard. Let us look into the British compensated slavery owner in 1833. When British abolished slavery in 1833, instead of compensating the freed African slave, they paid 20 euros to the former slave owners as compensation for using their labors. And guess what? The enslaved got nothing. Now imagine the Afro-Caribbeans and the Indian Caribbeans divided their demands for reparation. This allowed the Britons to make excuses again and again, claiming that they must prioritize one claim over the other, resulting in delay. If the Caribbean fight as one, the British cannot ignore us. The Indo-Caribbean and the Afro-Caribbean both suffered, so why would you want to treat them differently? Both groups face exploitation, poor living under the European colonization. By separating them, we are saying that one group suffering is important than the other. In Trinidad, labor strike in 1937, both Africans and Indian workers protest against unfair wages and working conditions. British authorities tried to divide them, but the workers stayed united, forcing the government to improve labor law for everyone. Just like the workers in Trinidad, if we separate our struggles, we weaken our fight. A joint reparation movement ensure equal justice for both the Indo and the Afro-Caribbean. We cannot allow unfairness to win. In closing, Mr. Speaker, the government may stand here today and argue for reparation, but I ask you, how can you separate what history has bonded together? Are we trying to tear apart a shared legacy of suffering? Are we in fact creating a division where they should be united? I ask, do you want a spark of conflict between two groups that has already suffered enough? Think again, ladies and gentlemen. The truth is undeniable. Indians' indentureship was marked by cruelty, exploitation, and abuse, just as slavery was. To separate one from the other is to ignore the sheer pain, the sheer struggles, and the sheer call for justice. We cannot pick and choose whose pain is better. Enough is enough. We will not stand here and allow the government to tear us apart. We'll fight together. Together we stand. Together we fall. I thank you.
And thank you very much to the first speaker from the opposition. We will now enter into that period of cross-examination. This will see the opposing team, Maggotty High School, posing questions to Club CD Bethel. The time will begin when you ask your first question, Maggotty High School.
My first question is, if the Indian indentureship laborers were treated fairly, why were they so many deceived, abused, and left in poverty?
Can you repeat the question, please?
If the Asian indentured laborers were treated fairly, why were so many deceived, abused, and left in poverty?
The argument never stated that the Asian indentureship were treated fairly. We never stated that. We stated that both groups suffered and that we should separate them so that both groups can receive separate justice for true reparations.
Your next question, Team Maggotty.
Second question. Don't you think separating the movement weakens the overall political pressure on former colonial powers to pay reparations?
Repeat the question, please.
Don't you think separating the movement weakens the overall political pressure on former colonial powers to pay reparations?
Separating the both gives it strength. Reparations for enslaved Africans and indentured Asians were different. They have different points. They experienced different things. So when we separate them, we give reparation to African enslaved for what they went through, and we give to Asians as well.
So if
Yes, your final question, Maggotty.
So if colonialism was the common root of both slavery and indentureship, why should we isolate these experiences when seeking justice?
Argument is not to isolate, but to separate. And even though they're both under colonialism, the nature of their treatment and conditions were completely different and contrasted. So therefore, having them together would not be a strong claim. Separating them would make the argument even stronger.
Thank you very much. We now invite Club CD Bethel to pose questions to Maggotty High School.
The first question, by opposing separate reparations, are you suggesting that the suffering of enslaved Africans is not significant enough to warrant its own restitution?
Can you repeat the question, please?
By opposing separate reparations, are you suggesting that the suffering of enslaved Africans is not significant enough to warrant its own restitution?
Sir, I am not hearing you clearly.
Okay, apologies. By opposing separate reparations, are you suggesting that the suffering of enslaved Africans is not significant enough to warrant its own restitution?
Although what we're forgetting is that they also went through the same pain as the Indians went through, so we cannot separate them. Repeat it.
You argue that sorry.
No, go ahead.
You argue that we should combine Asian and Atlantic in the curriculum. How do you reconcile this approach with the fact that slave Atlantic trade is legally recognized as crime against humanity?
I'm not hearing.
You argue that we should combine Asian indentureship with the reparation movement. How do you reconcile this approach with the fact that the UN's Durban Declaration of 2001 focuses on the unique historical suffering of enslaved Africans?
You answer, Maggotty?
Sir, I am not really hearing the question because he's very far, so I cannot really hear.
All right, so Club CB Bethel, your question one more time, a little bit louder.
You argue that we should combine Asian indentureship with the Caribbean reparation movement. How do you reconcile this approach with the fact that transatlantic slave is legally recognized as a crime against humanity?
How to reconcile what?
Which focuses on the unique historical suffering of enslaved Africans.
Both groups were victims of colonized exploitation, while enslaved Africans were taken by force and the Indian were deceived and also trapped.
All right, and the final question, Club Bethel.
We ignore the substantial difference between the nature of the suffering of African slaves and the Asian indentured workers when one was legally treated as property while the other group entered into labor contracts.
Although the Indians entered the contract, although the agents entered the contract, what happened is that they believed that they would be promised lands and opportunity and wealth. But when you get to look at it, is that they were also treated like the Africans. They were abused.
And additionally, the money that they received from the work that they did, they didn't receive enough because the money that they gained wasn't enough to pay off, because most of it would go into food, land, etc.
All right, thank you both teams for that period of cross-examination. At this point in time, we invite the Deputy Prime Minister, the second speaker, Jasmine Francois, to extend the case for Team Club CB Bethel.
Reparation for enslaved Africans are based on the unique harsh work conditions and the trauma it left on today's world. Asian communities with their own history of discrimination deserve justice. This fight stands on its own merit, not to be tied to reparations specifically owed to descendants of enslaved Africans. Speaking one of the opposition mentions, Indians and Chinese were tricked into labor. However, they still had free will, while Africans were stripped from their home without any choice. Ladies and gentlemen, the work conditions faced by Asian indentured laborers and enslaved Africans were bluntly different. The disparity provided compelling reasons for separating Asian indentureship and Caribbean reparation movement. Enslaved Africans were subject to brutal and dehumanizing conditions. Forced to work long hours under the scorching sun in the Caribbean, they enjoyed physical violence, brutal labor, and constant threat of punishment to maintain control over them. According to the National Museum labor pool, individuals were often beaten and overworked to the point of death, with high mortality rates due to poor nutrition, diseases, and abuse. In contrast, while Asian indentured laborers faced exploitation, their work conditions were not as inhumane. Indentured workers were bound by contracts that, although deceptive, provided an absolute end to their service after a specific number of years. Moreover, as noted in the Voyage of Clearance, indentured laborers had relatively better living arrangements, medical care, and lower mortality rate compared to enslaved Africans. While both groups endured hardship, the significant difference in their working environment, where enslaved Africans were treated as perpetual property with no legal right. Asian indentured workers positive freedom score, while the two systems were addressed separately in discussions about reparation. Lord, the treatment experienced by enslaved Africans goes beyond psychological stress to a deep mental illness caused by dehumanization, violence, and family separation, which led to generational emotional stress. Dr. Joy Degree, concept of post-traumatic slavery syndrome, explains how the oppression of slave Africans continue to impact their descendants today. Tommy and constant punishment strip individuals of their self-worth, creating a cycle.
Point of information.
I accept.
Why after the contract ended, they couldn't leave?
Can you repeat that?
Why after the contract ended, they couldn't leave?
The Asian indenturers could have left. The African slaves could not leave because they were considered property. This trauma is a key reason for separating Asian indentureship from the Caribbean reparation movement. Enslaved Africans were part of a deceased-based slavery where descendants inherited the legacy of oppression. In contrast, Asian indentured laborers face a different kind of trauma related to displacement and cultural dissonance. While this labor conditions were unfair, they were not considered property, and their descendants did not inherit a lifelong suppression. In conclusion, while both African descendants and Asian communities have enjoyed injustice, the legacy of slaves is a distinct, deeply ingrained trauma that warrants specific reparation for the descendants of enslaved Africans. The harsh condition, dehumanization, towards the man's target approach, while Asian communities deserve reparations for their experience. This history differs significantly from the enslaved Africans. It should be addressed separately. By recognizing these distinctions, we can move towards meaningful reparation that promotes healing, equality, and justice for all communities affected by this historical wrong. Let us not weaken the power of reparative justice by ignoring the unique legacies of the two systems. By acknowledging these distinct histories and addressing them accordingly, we can create more.
Point of information.
I decline. Targeted solutions that promote true equity and reconciliation for all communities affected by historical injustice. Let us move with the commitment to justice, to honor the individual struggles of each group, and to ensure that their voices are heard and their experiences are recognized. Thank you.
And thank you to the second speaker from Team Club CV Bethel, Jasmine Francois. We now invite Deshaun Brown from Maggotty High School to extend the case for side opposition.
Mr. Speaker, honorable judges, esteemed colleagues, and my worthy opponents, a pleasant afternoon. I stand firmly against the motion that this House believes that Asian indentureship should be separated from the Caribbean reparation movement. Our side asserts that Indian indentureship is an inseparable and essential part of the broader Caribbean reparation movement. Any attempt to isolate it is not only historically inaccurate, but also morally unjust. My role today is to expand on the points raised by my leader, dismantle the faulty reasoning of the proposition, and reaffirm why Asian indentureship must remain integrated within the Caribbean reparation movement. Mr. Speaker, my first point, they face shared historical trauma and systematic exploitation. Mr. Speaker, separating Asian indentureship from the Caribbean reparation movement ignores their shared history of exploitation. According to Hilary Beckles in 2013, both African slavery and Asian indentureship were forced labor systems designed to enrich colonial powers. Could you believe this? After slavery's abolition in 1834, the British replaced enslaved labor with indentured laborers. It was also stated by Brigid Lal in 1983 that many Indians were misled into migrating under false promises only to face harsh conditions. Over 500,000 Asians arrived in Caribbean between 1838 and 1917 with strict contracts that limited their freedom. So do you really call this free will? Indentured laborers endured grueling work, poor wages, physical punishment, and high mortality rates, making their experiences comparable to slavery. Excluding them from the reparation would be unjust, as reparation must address all colonial exploitation. Ignoring Asian indentureship could create division and resentment, undermining justice and unity in the Caribbean. Mr. Speaker, Karl Marx's theory of class struggles proves that Indian indentureship and African slavery were both tools of capitalist exploitation. After the abolition, British elites didn't end the oppression. They replaced enslaved Africans with indentured Indians just to maintain their profits. Both groups were forced into brutal labor under the colonial rule, enriching the European bourgeoisie while they remained in poverty. Dividing the repression movement only served the interests of the oppressors. Marx warns that the ruling class used divide and rule tactics. Decline. Marx warns that the ruling class used divide and rule tactics to weaken resistance. If reparations are about justice, we must unite against the colonial system that exploited both Africans and Indians, not separate their struggles. Mr. Speaker, the proposition unknowingly endorses a colonial strategy. Imperial powers use divide and conquer tactics just to maintain control. In 2004, Rhoda Reddox stated that British authorities deliberately pitted African and Indian communities against each other. And in Guyana and Trinidad, African descendants were labeled as freemen, while Indians were depicted as new slaves, fostering racial and social division. A united Caribbean reparation movement is stronger and reflects the interconnected struggles of both communities. Fragmenting the movement weakens our collective voice and allows former colonial powers to evade responsibility by arguing that no single group suffered enough just to justify reparation. My third and final point, practical unity. We have greater political and economic leverage. Mr. Speaker, beyond morality, unity offers practical benefits. A larger, more inclusive Caribbean reparation movement wields greater political and economic influence. And it is stated that Hilary Beckles said that the estimated value of reparation alone for African slavery alone exceeds 7.5 trillion euro, but including indentureship as moral urgency and economic weight. When CARICOM demanded reparation from the United Kingdom, they emphasized the intergenerational poverty left by all forms of colonial exploitation. Consider these examples. According to Kirk B., who in 2003. In Trinidad and Tobago, Indian laborers, descendants make up 35% of the population, and they still struggle with land displacement and economic exclusion. A united front can better advocate for collective compensation, such as development of funds for education and healthcare, land reparation for displaced community. United, we can push for a structural reparation that uplift all who suffered. Mr. Speaker, we cannot allow history to be rewritten or fragmented for political convenience. The experiences of Indian indentured laborers are not a separate chapter. They are woven into the same narrative of colonial exploitation that enslaved Africans endure. Their struggle, their pain, and their right to justice are inseparable from the Caribbean Reparation movement. By keeping Indian indentureship within the community, in the Caribbean Reparation movement, we must honor the full truth of our shared history, ensure justice is not partial. African and Indian alike must be included, receive the reparation they deserve. We stand together for unity, for justice, for a comprehensive acknowledgement of historical wrongs. For these reasons, and many more, we and the opposition firmly oppose this motion.
And thank you very much, Deshaun, for ending that second period of speeches. At this point, we're going to enter into the second and final cross-examination period. We invite Team Opposition to pose questions to Team Club Bethel.
First question. You argue that a unified reparation act would be more powerful, but can you provide examples of previous reparation acts that have successfully addressed distinct injustices within a single framework? Apologies. You argue that a unified reparation act would be more powerful, but can you provide examples of previous reparation acts that have successfully addressed distinct injustices within a single framework?
Is that the authorities try to divide them, but the workers stay together and fight in the government in order for them to receive whatever they need to receive. So it has been proven that in 1833, when slavery was abolished, the British would tend to fight along with the rest of the laborers to get out of it.
Sorry, if you're speaking Maggotty, I cannot hear you.
Repeat. You hear me now, sir?
Yes.
Okay. So we're saying that the British authorities try to divide them, but the workers in 1833, after slavery was abolished, they tend to fight together in order to improve the labor of the law for everyone.
Okay.
Given the 2015 CARICOM lawsuit recognizing the transatlantic slave trade as a crime against humanity, would you not agree that reparations should be tailored to specific historical injustices?
Can you please repeat that?
Given the 2015 CARICOM lawsuit recognizing the transatlantic slave trade as a crime against humanity, would you not agree that the reparations should be tailored against historical injustices?
That does not change the fact that both of them suffer the same issues, because the Asian indentureship, they suffered, they didn't get enough money or wages for their pay. They suffered physical afflictions with their one another's. And in slavery, that happened as well. So we should not separate them.
If we are to combine both Asian and Caribbean movements, how do you respond to the historical fact that enslaved Africans often subjected to systematic violence?
Will you please repeat?
If we are to combine both movements, how do you respond to the historical fact that enslaved Africans were often subjected to systematic violence?
Because because the Indians were contracted. So because the Indians were contracted, they endured the same pain that all the other Caribbean has endured. So the African went through abuse, pain, and same as the Indians. So if we try to separate them, then that mean we would have to try to compensate back all of the Caribbeans, and we would not want that. So it is best to keep them together.
All right, thank you very much. We now invite Maggotty High School to field questions to Club CV Bethel.
Since both enslaved Africans and indentured Asians contributed to the Caribbean economy under brutal conditions, why should one group receive reparation while the other is excluded?
We never stated that one group should not receive reparations. However, we are stating that both groups deserve justice, but on separate means for tailored reparation and justice. And both groups have helped the economy of the British, but under different terms and conditions. And they suffered and went and experienced different things, such as during the transatlantic slave trade, the Middle Passage.
If in if Asian indentureship was a system of forced labor that caused immense suffering, why should it not be included in the Caribbean reparation movement?
Because separation allows a stronger fight for both groups. Instead of combining or mashing them together, we allow separate fights for better justice for both groups.
But it was proven that both suffer conditions that led to death. So why should they be separated?
I'm sorry, repeat the question.
All right.
But it was proven that both suffer conditions that led to death. So why should they be separated?
It has been proven that 1.5 million Africans died during the Middle Passage, whereas the Asians had a less mortality rate and provisions were put in place for them to survive during the Middle Passage. Unlike Africans who were shackled together, and even though they had diseases and were sick, and they were thrown overboard after being contagious and died of sickness.
All right, thank you very much, both teams. At this point in time, we will now pause the debate for 1 minute to allow the teams to put the finishing touches on their reply speeches, after which we will invite the opposition reply speaker, followed by the proposition reply speaker, and that 1 minute starts now.
Madam Speaker, honorable judges,
We are
esteemed.
entering into a 1 minute pause, so you can take this 1 minute to refine your speeches, after which we'll invite the opposition speaker. So. Thank you very much. That is 1 minute. We now invite the opposition reply speaker. That speaker is, of course, Brittany Farquharson.
Madam Speaker, honorable judges, esteemed audience, and my opponents, good afternoon. Today, this House was asked to believe that Asian indentureship should be separated from the Caribbean reparation movement. But as the opposition, we've shown you clearly through logic, history, and moral clarity why this separation not only weakens the movement, but dishonors the shared legacy of struggle in our Caribbean society. I rise proudly to close this debate by reminding you that the call for reparations is not just about what was done. It is about who did it, how it was done, and why. Both African slavery and Asian indentureship were tools of the same colonial system, rooted in exploitation, racial hierarchy, and economic greed. Different instruments, yes, but played by the same oppressive hand. The proposition argues that indentured workers were not slaves, rather, as they signed contracts, received wages, and had the possibility of freedom after their contract ended. The contracted African slaves were forced into a lifetime of unpaid labor and have no legal rights. Now, Mr. Speaker, let's begin with the central question of today's debate. Do different forms of oppression demand separate reparation movements? The government would have you believe that because indentureship was contractual and slavery was not, the two must be separated. But we say difference in form does not mean difference in impact. Both systems left the communities impoverished, marginalized, and struggling with intergenerational trauma. Indentured laborers were lured with false promises, stripped of dignity, overworked, underpaid, and denied of social mobility, all under the same colonial empire that enslaved Africans. So how can we now pretend that their fight for justice is somehow disconnected? Secondly, Mr. Speaker, let's talk about strength, because strength is what this movement needs. By separating the reparation movement, we dilute its power, divide its voices, and make it easier for colonial powers to escape responsibility. Our opponents argue for tailored justice, but in reality, separation needs fragmentation. We don't need weaker divided voices. We need one Caribbean voice, united in history, united in identity, and united in purpose. Because the truth is, colonialism didn't see us as separate. It saw us as tools to be used and discarded, and we should not do its job for it by separating ourselves now. Thirdly, Mr. Speaker, let's reflect on the heart of the issue, justice. We, the opposition, recognize the unique cultural experiences of our Asian-descended brothers and sisters. And yes, their story deserves recognition. But separation is not the solution. Inclusion is. We can fight together under one banner for reparations that are inclusive, nuanced, and intersectional. Unity does not erase identity. It strengthens it. Together, we can demand a reparations framework that reflects all our stories, not just some. Madam Speaker, I close this by saying, colonialism did not divide us into oppression. It grouped us under the same system of abuse, humiliation, and exploitation. So why should we divide ourselves of our demand for justice? Let us not fragment what history has already shown to be united. Let us stand together, African, Indian, Chinese, all Caribbean people, because united we rise, divided we fall. Thank you.
And thank you very much for closing that debate for Team Opposition. And to conclude this debate overall, we invite Virginia Miller from Team Club CV Bethel.
To ensure justice is served accurately, we must recognize the distinct histories of both groups and create a reparations framework that acknowledges their unique experiences. Rather than weakening the call for justice by merging these movements together, we must commit to fairness and healing that honors each affected communities separately. Our opponents want you to think that separating Asian Indentureship and Caribbean Reparation Act would hinder the fight for reparation and weaken the claims of both groups. Whereas we have clearly outlined recognizing the distinct historical struggles highlights both groups and require appropriately tailored reparations for both Asian indentureship and the Caribbean reparation movement. This is why we agree to the motion Asian indentureship should be separated from the Reparation Act. The opposition would have stated that the Asians couldn't leave after their contracts ended, but sources have proven that Asians were allowed the opportunity to return home but denied the request because they felt their families would feel betrayed after being left, while Africans were never given choice to return home. The opposition claims that Asians suffered the same as enslaved Africans, although we have already proven that UN Durban Declaration and Program of Action explicitly recognizes the exploitation of chattel slavery as crimes against humanity, highlighting the legal and historical distinctions between these systems. The opposition stated that Africans were denied justice for reparations by the British, although it was already proven that the British paid out £20 million to compensate 3,000 families that owed slaves, way before Asian indentureship. While the opposition argued that unity among excluded communities strengthened the call for reparative justice, the reality is that the distinct histories and experiences of African descendants and indentured laborers require separate acknowledgement to ensure justice is properly served. Combining these movements risks oversimplifying the unique struggles each group faced. The legacy of slavery, with its deep racial oppression and intergenerational trauma, differs significantly from the unequal yet predetermined nature of indentureship. By addressing these issues separately, we ensure that the specific needs and historical context of each group are acknowledged and addressed ultimately, making the reparative justice more impactful and meaningful. The conversation should not be about colonialism, but separation for justice that is rightfully so. Both groups deserve their unique experiences to be heard. We, the proposition, clearly outlined that at the core of the distinction between slavery and indentureship is free will, a factor that demands separate approaches to justice. Enslaved Africans had no agency. They were forcibly taken, stripped of rights, and condemned to lifelong bondage. In contrast, indentured laborers, though often deceived, entered contracts that outlined eventual freedom. Slavery erased choice, while indentureship restricted it. Slavery was permanent. Indentureship had an end. To merge these histories is to diminish the lasting suffering of African descendants. Justice must be truthful, and truth demands separation. Subsequently, the proposition has vividly illustrated the stark differences in the working conditions of enslaved Africans and Asian indentured laborers, underscoring why their struggles must be addressed separately within the reparation movement. We would have expanded on the trauma of enslaved Africans, which runs deep across generations due to dehumanization, violence, and forced family separations. Dr. Joy DeGroo's post-traumatic slave syndrome explains how this oppression still fuels trauma, institutional discrimination, and socioeconomic struggles. Unlike enslaved Africans whose oppression was inherited, Asian indentured laborers faced hardships and displacement, but were never legally considered as property. Both Asian indentureship and African slavery represent grave historical injustices perpetuated by colonial powers in the Caribbean, but they are fundamentally different experiences requiring separate approaches to reparations. By maintaining the distinction between these movements, we can ensure that justice is served in a manner that truly acknowledges the histories and hardships of each group affected. After all, reparations must be a step toward true reconciliation, not a diluted compromise. Thank you.
And thank you very much for concluding the last match in round one of the International Reparation Debate Competition for 2025. The judges will now excuse themselves to have some discussions and return to you shortly with the winner of this match.
While conducting our research,
we, the students of the great Bethel Senior High School,
have found deep connection and understanding pertaining to reparation.
Our school is socially exposed
and carry many different ethnicities which can impact the nation.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Zoe Williams, and I attend the Maggotty High School, and I am the president of the Debating Society.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brittany Ferguson, an upper sixth form student at the Maggotty High School.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Deshaun Brown, and I'm a lower sixth student of the Maggotty High School.
And we are here to take our spot in the Reparation debating competition. Let me tell you why. Reparation matters, both to us and the school, because it seeks to address the long-lasting effects of injustices, particularly those stemming from slavery and colonialism, which shaped our societies and education systems. Reparation is about justice, restoration, and ensuring that the past wrongs do not limit the potential of the future generations, making it vital for personal, educational, and societal progress. Thank you.
The Center for Reparation Research is thrilled to launch this International Reparation Debate Competition. This International Reparation Debate Competition that we launched today for secondary schools is one of our most important projects. How do we engage youth on matters of reparatory justice? The change needed in the education system can only be advanced when the youth are engaged and their voices are heard.
Why is reparation so important in and for the Caribbean? Because time comes for justice for our ancestors. Time comes for the Caribbean to insist on the right to development, to be compensated for the violence against our ancestors. So outreach to the young people who have joined this movement is critical.
And this initiative is phenomenal. And you know why? Because it's engaging with young people. And it's young people that I believe, are going to be the future of the reparatory justice movement. The greatest weapon that there is in this whole fight for reparatory justice is the young people of today. I hope this debate spurs a whole new generation of advocates for reparatory justice, and the UK and the EU have got to make amends for the ills of the transatlantic slavery. This is going to be a phenomenal competition.
There is no mass movement that isn't a youth movement. And we certainly want reparations to be a mass movement. So it's really exciting, though, to have a regional / international debating competition. And I'm looking forward to your participation as you construct your arguments for and against, remembering that the 10-point plan for reparatory justice is our guiding framework for the areas in which we are demanding compensation, because we certainly want to impact the public opinion and awareness in Europe. So it's fantastic to have the United Kingdom participating as well.
So why is it important for youth to be involved in the reparation movement? Being involved in the reparations movement is critical to youth if one is to know their history so that they can understand why their societies are functioning as they are today. The future of the countries we live in are dependent on the current situation that exists today in our countries. And these current conditions were created by the past, including indigenous genocide, African enslavement, indentureship, and colonization. Being involved in reparations is about seeking justice, seeking a way to reduce inequalities in our own countries and then in the broader world. It's about seeking a more peaceful and balanced world, where global problems are solved in partnerships, not in isolation. I believe the sponsors are hoping this competition will allow our youth to gain knowledge about the past so that as young people, you'll be able to make better decisions in the future and make our countries better places.
We know that we need to understand stories about people that look like us. So the fact that so many of you young people have registered was so encouraged by your enthusiasm and your passion for wanting to enter this debate. It is so important. It's just at the core of who we are, that we need to understand where we come from, understand our true history, and having a debate competition on this particular topic is such an important milestone. To have a real conversation about repair, and the fact that our young people were so articulate with their presentations and to ensure that we keep educating our young people, because you are the future of us and are the Caribbean's a sustainable future. So congratulations, everybody.
We are looking forward to the debate. Encourage everyone to join the debate. Thank you so much, all.
Where is the justice for the 5 million enslaved Africans trafficked to the Caribbean? Think about it. Chattel slavery didn't just end. It left deep, painful scars across each Caribbean country. The deliberate underdevelopment, the brutal trauma and violence we inherited. It's time to repair this damage so we can build thriving, sustainable economies where young people like us can dream big, achieve more, and live better lives right here in our own home. Do you see why repair matters? Stand with us, join the calls for justice, and sign the petition for reparations at repaircampaign.org/petition.
It's very important that this is understood, because we can't talk about legacies before talking about what left those legacies on our landscape. Enslaved Africans were subjected to the worst atrocities imaginable: kidnapping, storage in filthy barracoons, the Middle Passage, forced drowning as in the case of the slaver Zong, branding with hot iron, including by the church, with SPG being seared into the flesh of those they owned, unrelenting field and factory labor, legal codes that rendered them non-human, and harsh punishments when they resisted enslavement, deportation, dismemberment, hanging, imprisonment, severe flogging, including of women and the children. According to Lucille Mathurin Mayer, and I quote, "Neither age nor pregnancy exempted women from corporal punishment. Rather, they were laid down in the filthiest place the driver could find for floggings. Child labor was rampant, and women and girls faced sexual violence." Orlando Patterson wrote in his Sociology of Slavery the following: "The sexual exploitation of female slaves by white men was the most disgraceful aspect of Jamaican slave society." Unfortunately, the church was complicit in this crime against humanity. Initially, Christian planters did not think that the African was of theological significance. According to Elsa Gavaya, and I quote, "Early English slave law almost totally neglected the enslaved as a subject for religious instruction, as a member of a family, or as a member of society possessing some rights, as the same rights as everyone else."
Did you grow up on Anansi stories? Yep, most of us have. But did you know that Anansi played a major role in our ancestors' survival? So let's talk about it. He's more than just a trickster spider. He was a means of inspiration for resistance.
Anansi's cleverness in outsmarting his rivals mirrored tactics enslaved people used in their daily lives. By pretending to be foolish or inept, a technique known as play fool for catch wise, enslaved people lower their enslavers' expectations and reduce suspicion. These methods, inspired by Anansi, are known as Anansi tactics, or in Chui from Ghana, Anansi Sem. Anansi outwitted powerful animals and even white enslavers using cunning and wit. During the plantation era, Anansi tales were shared in enslaved quarters and sometimes in front of European enslavers. These stories, recorded in journals, reveal how enslaved people used public performances to mask hidden defiance. Plantation whites often miss the rebellious messages in these tales. Caribbean Anansi stories depict him evading punishment, tricking enslavers, and a whole plethora of adventures which highlight the resistance and survival through Anansi tactics.
400 years ago, my people were dragged from their homes, tribes, families, placed on floating wood, and shipped across the Atlantic to what will be later described as the most inhumane act of all time. Cold, dark, uncomfortable, cannot describe the trip in ships where whips did not fail to miss. Injustice, rape and disgrace, blood rains, brute, force, ignorance, hate in their veins. Sweat and tears, labor revealed, produce from king fields only for the esteemed. 400 years of eroding one's pride, culture, heritage, value. 400 years of the iron chain, stringing up, leaving bare. Oh, but they never cared. Why fight when you would be met with sharp blades? So don't you dare cry out in fear. Why not plan escape with the plaiting of one's hair? Oh, the drums, listen, dance, communicate. For tonight we fight a battle not even death could spare. Blue eyes, white skin, master said that's beauty within. But guess what? Black, brown, gold, royalty, reparations we are owed. Them say hassa, but we say cassava. That's where we get the strength from to beat and conquer. For tonight we're returning to Ghana. You may say, I'm a descendant of slaves because of the rich melanin that gushes from my pores. But I came to tell you tonight, I am not a slave, rather the descendant of kings and queens. I am the embodiment of the divine. I do not chase, I align, I attract. What's meant for me already has my name on it. I am the personification of beauty, the expression of love, the creator of life, the acknowledgement of freedom. So go ahead, call me what you want, because when I die, bury me in the oceans where my ancestors jumped from the ships, because they knew death was better than bondage.
And here's what does need reparative justice. It is the seasoning period when we landed on the soil and they took away our names and our gods and our culture, and no slave system that we understand thus far has ever had that deculturalization process embedded in the process of our enslavement. So our enslavement was not just physical, it was not just culture, it was spiritual, because you took me away from everything. Who then must I look up to? Who then must I emulate? Who then must I kill myself in order to elevate you?
What is common about the wealth? A flag raises high, but the strings still pull from London. We sing our anthems in borrowed tongues, march to the beat of siphons' drums, celebrating a freedom that still pays tribute. Independent? What is that when the governor's shadow still lingers? They tell us, we free. Tell that to the bones at Rappery. The 196 who fought and won only to drown in chains. Our Negmawan. Do the people of North Devon not hear the howls raging for their home? The tide spits their cries, their names foam in fury, salted by a sea that will not forget. They call us independent, yet a crown still sits above 14 nations, still bent at the knee, still ruled by a throne built from our gold. They took our labor, snatched our names, they welcomed our craft, then cast us adrift. Windrush mothers, fathers, exiled from the empire they built. What is common about the wealth? Our persistent potency that perseveres through acute artistry. We carve language into legacy, turn sorrow into song, drum resistance as rhythm, sink steel into symphony. We are the architects of new worlds, the poets, the painters, the prophets, who make home in remnants still, who forge futures from fractured pasts. They took the wealth, but we are the riches.
And remember that chattel slavery of the African people was also genocide. This is not highlighted sufficiently. If you take my home island of Barbados in the Caribbean, the British brought 600,000 people into Barbados. 600,000 Africans were brought into Barbados. The black population of Barbados today is 280,000. How do you reduce 600,000 to 290,000 after 200 years? They brought 3 million into Jamaica. At the end of the slavery malarkey, there were just about 600,000. The survival rate of African people in the Caribbean was about 17%. It was horrendous.
The Conference of Heads of Government of the Caribbean Community.
But I will say to you, therefore, that the issue of reparations for the transatlantic slavery is an issue that we will take up with you, and that the appropriate apology and compensation is paid, and that the international community accepts that this should never happen again.
And yes, Honorable Deacon Mitchell, slavery is a crime against humanity.
The concept of reparations would take the question of development repair, and it would be multi-generational. What needs to happen is face-to-face discussions, which we deem as absolutely important, because if you can't see me or hear me, it is not appropriate to be able to make a judgment as to who or what I am and what I should receive.
Progress also means reparatory justice to heal historical wounds and climate justice to secure our future. We must be bold, demand what is old, and build a Caribbean that thrives.
Reparation Research is thrilled to launch this international reparation debate competition. This international reparation debate competition that we launched today for secondary schools is one of our most important projects. How do we engage youth on matters of reparatory justice? The change needed in the education system can only be advanced when the youth are engaged and their voices are heard.
Why is reparations so important in and for the Caribbean? Because time comes for justice for our ancestors. Time comes for the Caribbean to insist on the right to development, to be compensated for the violence against our ancestors. So outreach to the young people who have joined this movement is critical.
And this initiative is phenomenal. And you know why? Because it's engaging with young people. And it's young people that I believe, okay, are going to be the future of the reparatory justice movement. The greatest weapon that there is in this whole fight for reparatory justice is the young people of today. I hope this debate spurs a whole new generation of advocates for reparatory justice, and the UK and the EU have got to make amends for the ills of the transatlantic slavery. This is going to be a phenomenal competition.
There is no mass movement that isn't a youth movement. And we certainly want reparations to be a mass movement. So it's really exciting, though, to have a regional stroke international debating competition. And I'm looking forward to your participation as you construct your arguments for and against, remembering that the 10-point plan for reparatory justice is our guiding framework for the areas in which we are demanding compensation, because we certainly want to impact the public opinion and awareness in Europe. So it's fantastic to have the United Kingdom participating as well.
So why is it important for youth to be involved in the reparation movement? Being involved in the reparations movement is critical to youth if one is to know their history so that they can understand why their societies are functioning as they are today. The future of the countries we live in are dependent on the current situation that exists today in our countries. And these current conditions were created by the past, including indigenous genocide, African enslavement, indentureship, and colonization. Being involved in reparations is about seeking justice, seeking a way to reduce inequalities in our own countries and then in the broader world. It's about seeking a more peaceful and balanced world, where global problems are solved in partnerships, not in isolation. I believe the sponsors are hoping this competition will allow our youth to gain knowledge about the past so that as young people, you'll be able to make better decisions in the future and make our countries better places.
We know that we need to understand stories about people that look like us. So the fact that so many of you young people have registered was so encouraged by your enthusiasm and your passion for wanting to enter this debate. It is so important. It's just at the core of who we are that we need to understand where we come from.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are back. The judges have decided, and via unanimous decision, we know who the winner of this match is and who the final automatically advancing team to round 2 is. So this debate questioned whether or not Asian indentureship should be separated from the Caribbean reparation movement. So what did we hear happening in this debate? Well, firstly, we heard a brilliant, in the eyes of the panel, quite a brilliant opening speech from Club Bethel, from their first speaker, Devon Miller. He provided a context, which the judges particularly enjoyed and loved. Yes, and then he explained through that context that, quite frankly, Asian indentureship and those of us who were enslaved through the transatlantic slave trade were not the same. He pointed it out that they're not the same, and he told me as well the differences that separated them. He told me that the difference lies in the methods of their relocation. Yes, in as much as the enslaved individuals were piled together like sardines in quite disturbing conditions, and he painted a very vivid picture. And in painting that picture, he painted a bad, but albeit not as bad as enslavement picture of what happened with Asian indentureship. He says that, well, in one situation, they're owned, considered property, and in another situation, they're offered contracts, harsh contracts, but there is still the choice to do or not to do, whereas that choice was not afforded to those who were victims of enslavement. And in fact, they were never seen as property, Asian indentureship. And so we really appreciated that setup for the debate from the first speaker. And I think that idea is one that was contested throughout the debate, the differences between the conditions. What we wanted, though, is in no uncertain terms to understand why the difference between treatment should lead to a separation from the movement. Because even if the judges buy that one set of people were treated worse than another set of people, in as much as we were all treated poorly and badly and taken advantage of, we need to understand why the distinction between the levels of treatment and the harshness of treatment justified that separation. It was, we think, sufficiently proven by the end of the first speech that there is a distinction between the treatment. We wanted to know why that distinction should then automatically translate into a separation, right? But in fact, Maggotty didn't agree. They didn't think that the distinction was that significant. It existed, Maggotty conceded, but they didn't think it's distinctive enough to cause a separation. And we heard from them that the contracts were just an illusion. Yes, and that they were actually treated with slave labor almost as badly as a slave, and all the horrible and harmful things there. And we found that the debate kind of centralized around the treatment of the individuals. But then we thought the debate needed to move past that, because again, even if we prove that they were treated worse, we need to know why does that matter in terms of the separation. And even if they weren't treated worse, we needed to understand why does that matter in terms of the separation. And we got some kind of solvency for that issue coming out from Maggotty. Yes, we heard it from the first speaker of Maggotty, Sophie Williams. Sophie told us that, well, one, if we separate the Asian indentureship from the Caribbean reparation movement, then it will weaken both claims to reparations. Yes, she gave this united we stand, divided we fall kind of analysis. She says, and she didn't just make it as a claim, she warranted it. She showed us in two ways how being separated was going to lead to worse outcomes. One, if we're separated, then the colonizers and those who we demand reparations from can use it as an excuse to say, listen, I'm juggling the arbitration of two different groups asking me for reparations. Give me more time to solve this particular problem. And that's bad. She also gave me another analysis that they can then say, if we give to one group of individuals, for example, the victims of the transatlantic trade slave, then we simply won't have the capacity to give to the other, the Asian indentureship. Or if they choose to give to the Asian indentureship, then they can say, we can't afford to give it to the victims of the transatlantic slave trade. So two distinct mechanisms with which we will suffer if it is that we separate the movement. The judges found that particularly convincing. And inasmuch as that idea wasn't sufficiently contended with, an idea that we thought was convincing and that was left to stand in the debate, we had to credit that idea as much as that idea was presented in the substantive. And we thought that was a really good job from Sophie. We also heard as well from Deshawn, a little bit of a derivative speech, but with that additional idea that if we separate, what that starts to create is a hierarchy of suffering within the Caribbean region. And that can lead to other social, economic, political, and all other sorts of discontent and disconnection within the Caribbean bloc, which is not something that we want. We wanted to hear a little bit more about that idea. We thought the first part of your speech, Deshawn, was really derivative. A lot of it would have been said already by Sophie. And so we wanted to hear something new or something deeper analyzed. And in fact, this idea of the hierarchy came out from Zophie, but then you went into it and fleshed it out. We wanted you to do more of that. There's little to no utility in repeating arguments that have already been proven and posited in the debate, especially if they haven't been contended with. And so we want to give you some serious credit for recognizing that this idea of the hierarchy of suffering leading to a disconnect within the Caribbean bloc being a particularly bad thing. We want to give you credit for that. Ladies and gentlemen, at the end of the debate, we thought that the team winning this match and securing that coveted final automatic advancement to round 2 is the team in opposition, Maggotty High School. Congratulations, Maggotty. Congratulations. And well fought, Club CV Bethel. Maggotty High School now gets that automatic advancement to round 2. Club CV Bethel now wonders if they have done enough to secure one of only 4 wildcard slots. We will see very shortly. Ladies and gentlemen, the best speaker from this match comes to us from the winning team, Maggotty High School. And that speaker is Zophie Williams, the first speaker. Congratulations, Zophie. We particularly loved your analysis on how a separated reparations cry can be, it weakens both claims. You should be very, very proud of yourself.
Thank you, sir.
Zophie. Commendations as well to Devon Miller from Club Bethel. Ladies and gentlemen, the scores for this match: Club Bethel on 258 points to Maggotty High School's 266 points, a 8-point difference. With that, we now conclude this, the final match of the International Reparation Debate Competition, which falls quite nicely on the 60th anniversary of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, their 60th anniversary. It has been a tremendous experience to be with you throughout these matches in round 1. And I am sure that the matches coming up in round 2 are going to be fiercer, harsher, with greater, more detailed analysis and argumentation, maybe a little bit of attitude in the rebuttals. But either way you take it, what we're going to be having is a wonderful competition. If round 1 is anything to go by, ladies and gentlemen, you're going to want to see round 2. But until then, I'm Ravon Thomas Matthews, thanking once again our sponsors and partners, the University of the West Indies, CARICOM, the CARICOM Reparations Commission, the Center for Reparations Research, the Jamaican Association for Debating and Empowerment, the Repair Campaign, the PJ Patterson Institute for Africa, Caribbean Public Advocacy, and the University of Hull. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and we'll see you in round 2. Well played, CV Bethel.